Hello everyone, it is time for this week's live stream. I want to thank my sponsor Fritz Aquatics for supporting this channel. They provide the salt that I use. I use a glass cleaner. I use their Fritz 460 to eat waste out of the rock work. I use a bunch of their products, and so I recommend the same to you as well because it works for me. Coral Magazine is out. This is the latest issue that's arrived at fish stores and also in your mailboxes if you're a subscriber. If you're not one, you should be. So do it. I'm working on the next issue now. We are in the layout process and final edits. It goes to print, and if you subscribe now, you will get the next issue. If you delay, if you don't spend the $39 that it costs, it's not that much money. So I'm going to keep pushing you guys. What is that? Half of a Frag? It's just, 6 issues. You get a whole year's subscription. Plus, you get the digital edition that lets you go back like 10 years through all the older articles. And, so you have access to a full library of information. And it's all there for you. And this is a publication written to really help the hobbyist. It's the stuff is sometimes it can be very deep. Sometimes it's a little lighter, easier to consume. It definitely reaches all audiences, and aquarium maintenance companies read it. We got scientists that read it. We've got marine biologists that read it. We've got average hobbyists that read it. Newbies all the way to advanced hobbyists. Come on, it's for everybody. So you should be a subscriber. I offer consultation services. If you need help with your tank, I can do it one-on-one with a video chat. So I would encourage you to let me know, and I will schedule an appointment with you. Rogers Reef is a new sponsor of the channel. It is a frozen food that doesn't blow around in your tank and is easy for your fish to consume because they're eating it in chunks right off of the piece. So I wanted to bring all that to your attention, and now it's time for this week's live stream. Hello everyone. Hey, by the way, I've got a new light over here. Let me move the camera. Oh, I didn't set it up. My mistake. Let me set that up. And then we'll move the camera. I was so prepared. Let's try... What happens if I go this way? Nope. It's always the opposite. It's the opposite. Look, it's a white light. Oh, stupid thing. It wants to keep me in the frame. So it is a white light on that tank now. Oh, come on. Everything's backwards on these controls. So I'm going to scoot in. I'm going to zoom in for you guys. Well, don't do that. Don't make it impossible to look at. Oh my God, the thing does not... It'd be easier if I could just pick up the webcam and just walk it over there. Oh my God, look at this. Out of control. It's so bad. And I can't do anything to highlight it to make it not look so blown out, but it looks really good in person. Maybe if I'm in the frame, it'll fix itself. Let's see. Will it auto-adjust again? No? Let's do this. Nope. All right, forget it. I give up. Let's come over here. Hey, I'm over here. Follow me, camera. Thank you very much. All right, well, that was a waste of your time. Anyway, I have a white light on there because the Blenny has blue spots and or red spots, I'm sorry, but it has blue in its body, and under blue lighting, blue is invisible, so it's pointless. So that light arrived yesterday, and the tank looks completely different to me. I actually like daylight, and so, while it may not glow, it definitely serves a good purpose for me. I want to remind you there's some upcoming events that I'll be at. October 19th, I'll be at the Maine Reef Expo and Frag Swap. On November 1st, I will be at the Long Island Reef Association Club meeting. So if you're anywhere near there and you want to attend their meeting, you can come hang out. And I'm not sure where it's taking place, but that puts you, come on, it's called the Long Island Reef Association. So it's got to be somewhere near the Long Island Reef Aquarium, which, the 20,000-gallon reef that Joe has been taking care of for over 20 years. You got to see that in person. So maybe it's the same building. Maybe it's next door. I don't know. But you should go see the aquarium anyway because it's fantastic. And it looks amazing. It's actually been growing so well that Joe's been cutting pieces out of it and removing them. It's like, no, quit messing up your reef. And then on November 9th, I will be at the Boston Reefer Society Fragsgiving 2024. So, and by the way, that one has Richard Ross going to be there as well as Chris Meckley. So if you're wanting to meet people like them and me, I'll be at those 3 different events. There's some news. And of course, I don't have it in front of me. Let me pull up my phone, it'll be easier. So, this one here is actually a really big deal, and the news broke yesterday. And this is a press release from the EPA. And the title is EPA reaches settlement with Underwater Creations Inc. in St. Louis Park, Minnesota for alleged pesticide violations. And it's actually pretty short. Chicago, September 27th, 2024. Today, United States Environmental Protection Agency announced a settlement with Underwater Creations Inc. of St. Louis Park, Minnesota to stop the sale of unregistered pesticide products. The settlement requires the company to stop production and pay a $226,652 penalty. EPA cited the company for allegedly distributing or selling 5 unregistered pesticides: Vibrant Reef, Vibrant Saltwater, Vibrant Freshwater, Expel, and Purge, intended to destroy aquarium pests. Under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, products that claim to kill, destroy, prevent, or repel pests, including the sort found in an aquarium, are considered pesticides and must register with EPA to ensure they perform as intended and are appropriately labeled before distribution or sale. So if you have been using Vibrant in the past and you just thought, well, it's okay to use, that's been under debate for some time. I've never used it myself. I kept hearing the negative buzz, and I was like, that's just not for me. But that product's been available on many websites for some time now, and some people said it worked for them, and others said it destroyed their reef aquarium. So I'm just letting you know, the EPA sent out a news report yesterday that they're fining the company for being misleading, and that they were to stop production immediately. So if you're using that, think twice, just because you want to be careful. And if you see it on the shelves, you might want to just avoid it. Like I said, I've never used it. There's so many other products we can use. There's really no reason to take chances. So I want to bring that to your attention, and I want to thank Mike, who posted that in our Club Miller's Reef today. That's what brought it to my attention. I didn't even know. All right. So today's topic is about keeping SPS and adding SPS to your aquarium. SPS stands for Small Polyp Stony. And I've got some pictures here to show you. Let's just use a really nice mashup picture. Actually, I use this one pretty often because I love it so much. So we'll put this right here on the screen. This right here is a combination of all kinds of different SPS corals, mostly Acropora. There's also bird's nest in there. And yes, that's the 2 types, Acropora and bird's nest. And then you can see different shapes, different colors, different styles. The bird's nest is more rounded. The Acropora on the top, the purple one, is one shape. The green one is a little different with the longer stems, the staghorn look. That reddish one, man, I wish I'd kept that one. It didn't survive in my tank, but it was also really, really pretty. So these types of corals are what we're talking about today, and this is considered I think it is considered a pinnacle coral. Many times when people come in the hobby, they start off with what's easy, what's going to live, what's going to put up with me, with the learning curve. And then people say softies are your best bet. Well, they purchase mushrooms, zoanthids, gorgonian, leathers. These are the soft type corals that you can get, and they usually fill the tank in rather rapidly, so that way you're not looking at a pile of rock and you're looking at just a few little things. But SPS corals, on the other hand, are a completely different animal, and they need a lot of TLC, and that's why it's considered a pinnacle coral. It's not that easy thing that you can stick in your tank and ignore. I mean, wouldn't that be nice? But that's not reality. So let me show you another one. This is one of my favorites. Now I'm going to keep being honest with you, which is important. These don't work out. I mean, you put them in your tank and they could be fantastic for many years, and then poof, they're gone. That is the downside of keeping SPS corals. You don't know how long you're going to keep them. Ideally, you want to keep them forever. And under ideal conditions, you should always have new growth, and then you just cut off the old undergrowth, the skeletal base that has nothing to it. I mean, it's just skeleton. It's just structure. And you would snip that off and replant the living part back on the rockwork and let it grow. And where you put it in the tank, well, we're going to talk about placement, but I just want to point out that if you're doing a good job and the SPS corals are growing, they're going to grow upwards toward the light. And the higher they go, the less room they have before they breach the surface. So if we're trying to grow a bunch of SPS corals in a tank, you need to have your rockwork low enough that there's vertical height for the corals to go upwards. If you run your rockwork really high up, then you're going to plant the corals down lower and you're going to end up seeing rock, and it's just kind of a weird thing. It's better to have an open area with water and flow moving across it. And that was Jack. I apologize for the barking in the background. Here is an example of a coral that grows vertically. Oh, I didn't even show you the other one. Well, I'll show it to you in a second. So this right here is a Montipora digitata, and it is in the SPS family. And the reason it's in the SPS family is because those little tiny orange mouths, those are the small polyps. Small polyp, and then it's a stick, stony coral. And this one here has been growing vertically instead of growing out horizontally, because you can see all that bird's nest all surrounding it, and the stick wants to survive. It wants to keep going upward. It's a very pretty colony when it becomes large, but for now what I've got is a little twig sticking up. The other coral I was going to show you, and it's one I've wanted forever, and I had it for a while, and now it's gone, is the pearlberry. And for some crazy reason, I cannot remember this name ever unless it's on the file name. I constantly want to call it something orchid. Every time I think of this coral, my brain's orchid. Well, that's wrong. What is it? What is it? What is it? I'm like, well, I know it's that really pretty coral I like, but for some reason the word pearlberry does not stick with me. So this is an acropora. It's a very pretty colony. It tends to have a greenish hue in the core. It has the lavender tips. It's just super nice. And a friend of mine, Bradley, he grew a ginormous colony of it. And I mean, it just tabled out and was just fantastic. And that's what I wanted in my tank. But unfortunately, my bird's nest outpaced it, grew quicker, and smothered it. And it's gone. I have none. So, just want to let you know that. This is another acropora. It's got a funny name, and for some reason in my tank it isn't. But this one here is literally called yellow tip. There's nothing yellow about it. It's purple tip, but the core kind of has a yellowish hue to it. It's not white, it's kind of yellow. Maybe under my lighting or the perspective, from the side view I'm looking at it, it kind of looks, more in the whitish, but it is a yellow hue. But it definitely isn't yellow tip. So, I don't know. Maybe I got the name wrong. But this is another type of acropora. And so you can see, well, I don't know. I hope you can see that getting these types of corals can be super appealing. It's so beautiful. At least it is for me. I love it. Now I realize the only thing that's going to move on there are going to be the little tiny polyps. So if you're standing back, you're going to see rigid sticks. But as you get closer, or if you were to use your phone or a camera to zoom in, then you can see these amazing little polyps. They're super duper pretty, and they're waving in the breeze. Here's another picture of some polyps. This is on a type of greenish acro. I got this one from Dwayne a while back. And you can see those little fists of happiness right there in the foreground. And then I got this one here. This is a totally different type of coral. It's in the tort family. And again, those little polyps are the mouths. That's how they inhale food. So you can see this would not be an easy coral to feed. And as I said at the beginning, it's a pinnacle coral. It is not an easy coral to keep. Now, if you wanted an easy SPS, like I mentioned before, you want this one. So this is called bird's nest. And it comes in many different types. I'd say there's probably 5 styles of bird's nest available. This one here is the greenish one. I like it because it's kind of three-dimensional. It's fluffy. But inside the core, which you can kind of see, there's like a white stick in there. And bird's nest grows really, really fast. It really fills in. My reef right now has a ton of bird's nest, and I need to give someone a 2-foot section. But bird of paradise also has this shape. But then there's a hot pink bird's nest that's super duper sharp and beautiful to look at. Here's another example of some SPS. And you can see the blue tort there. And you can see the bird's nest behind it. See, it's a completely different looking polyp. That blue tort is amazing, by the way. And I still have some of it, which is good. And then there's some Montipora in the background too. Oh yeah, the plating Montipora is also in the SPS family. So while my brain is thinking Acropora today, SPS does include the spiraling coral Montipora. All right. Okay, so when it comes to choosing what you want to have in your tank, SPS provides so many choices of color. It provides different shapes. It can handle quite a bit. I mean, it's not fragile. It's not like okay. It's not impossible is what I'm trying to say. And I've had people say, hey, I tried SPS, it never works out for me. And I'm always wondering, well, what were you doing for that it not to work out? And there's a few things that can happen. Okay, so number one, you could be handling it way too much. You got a piece from someone and you just stuck it in your tank and you used your man fist and you mashed it as you're trying to press it into the rock and you just damaged it. It could be that you dipped it in something that was way too strong, too harsh, and it basically weakened the coral so much that when you finally put it in your tank, it died. It could be that a fish was nipping at it. You may have a fish that just loves Acropora, for dinner, and will just eat every single polyp until there's nothing left for the coral to do but die. And then you end up with a dead skeleton in your tank, which you remove. It could be your water parameters are atrocious, and yet you think they're fine. And the only way to know that is through water testing, and we'll get into that. But, those are just a few of the things that can happen. And then finally, it could be that your lights are way too weak to support SPS growth, and you need a better light fixture. So those are some of the things that you want to think about. Now, SPS stands for Small Polyp Stony, but the acronym that came out a long time ago was Stability Promotes Success. So the more stable your water is, the more likely these corals will do well in your tank. Now, I did grab a video of my tank because someone asked me last week, how's your reef doing? So here it is. This was shot last night before lights out, so it's kind of dim. It's not so bright, and you can see it's pretty full. There's Spock in the center of the tank, the Nassau tang. I've had her for 20 years. The hammer coral to the right, the big green blob-looking thing under that pajama cardinal fish, is also been with me about 20-some years, maybe 22 years. And I grew that, from initial frag, and it's been fragged many, many times. These were replanted a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, when Dwayne was here to help me reset the reef, and it was all flat and low. In the meantime, it has grown into a giant, nice, rounded bush. It's doing pretty well. Now, unfortunately, my tank has way too many anemones in it right now, and that is something that you want to consider if you're trying to keep SPS corals. Should you have anemones in the same tank? Because when the anemone makes contact with the SPS coral, most likely the SPS coral will die. The anemone tends to win most of these battles with its nematocysts, its stinging cells, and the coral can take a few licks, but then after a while, it just says, that's it. And now, it could be, if the colony is big enough, the SPS colony is large, it could be that the edge gets cooked by the anemone, and other than that, it's fine. In other words, the rest of the colony is perfectly fine, looks beautiful, and you might just have this white, like a white picket fence between the coral and the invertebrate, where it's being stung. And you can do that. You can actually consider these corals around the anemone are going to be sacrificed. They are there to create a boundary to keep their tentacles in one area, and the rest of my colony is completely safe. And that can work in a tank. But if the anemone decides to start walking around and it stings stuff in the process, it can really do some damage. So, I think it was Dwayne wrote me just the other day and said, hey, I will never, ever have something in my tank that isn't bolted down. And he's talking about no rose anemones, no bubble tips, no sea bays, no nothing, because he just likes his beautiful stony corals. And I get that process. And, the problem is I have not leaned over into my tank and started pulling them out left and right like I should have. And I should have done it many months ago. So at this point, when you're looking at my tank, you will see them kind of everywhere. And it's really my job to remove them. But I would say about 2/3 of my tank is SPS corals. And then I guess the rest third, the other third is mainly LPS. I really do like LPS corals. I think I have a greater affinity for them than SPS, but I constantly buy SPS corals. When I'm at a Frag swap, when I'm at Reef Stock or Macna or Aquashella or, any of those, or even sometimes in a fish store. I see an SPS coral, I gotta get it. I gotta plant it somewhere in my tank. There's always room for one more. And when it comes to planting them in there, there's a specific process that you should do. Now, let's jump back to... I'm going to also show you this. This is the end view of the tank from last night. And for some reason, the water didn't look as clear on camera as it did to my eye. I don't know why. I hadn't put food in the tank yet. And, maybe it is time to run some carbon, but I was really... I'm looking at the tanks like, it looks way more clear than this. Why is the phone doing that? But... you can see the hammer coral there in the foreground. You can also see on the right, in the shadows, that is the gorgonian that I got so long ago. And it seems to be self-contained. It never gets taller. It never really gets bigger. It just keeps living in that spot, which is helpful for me, practical, but not really ideal if I'm trying to share frags of it. Now, I have fragged it a few times for various people, and maybe I'm just expecting more growth out of it than I'm getting, but it's still a really nice colony. But underneath the hammer coral, you can see there are some anemone tentacles moving back and forth. All of those should not be there. They're definitely not benefiting my tank. They're affecting my Duncan corals. I had to reach in and remove the Duncan colony and peel off about 7 anemones off of it a few nights ago. And then yesterday I looked in the tank thinking the Duncans would be nice and open, and a new anemone had stood on it. I'm like, how dare you? So I really have to do some serious collecting and removal from the tank to create more space. At the top of the tank, you can see Spot got in the way. You can see the water surface, and that's really important. If the surface of your tank does not ripple like that all the time, you may not be getting proper gas exchange, which could affect whether your SPS corals do well or not. So I would always urge you to have good rippling surface movement. That's really, really important. And you need to have vertical space for the corals to grow upward. And as you can see, that bird's nest in the, let's say the 12:30 o'clock spot in this video, that right there, it's about an inch from the surface. It's up there. It needs to go. But it's not a coral that grows up. It grows out. It's just, it has so much mass underneath, it has become taller over the last couple of years. Now, the acropora to the left, right above the hammer coral, oh, it stopped moving. That acropora still has 3 or 4 inches of room for vertical growth. That staghorn can continue to grow and get larger and larger. Now, as staghorns grow, they tend to grow, upward and outward, and they can grow toward the front glass. And then when you're using your cleaning magnet and you're going back and forth, you might break off a branch accidentally because, it got in the way, the magnet hit it, and it snapped. Now, acropora have a semi-rigid skeletal core, and if your strontium level in the tank isn't high enough, they're more brittle. They're more apt to break. So if you are keeping your strontium level around 8.0 ppm, or maybe that's mech per liter. Well, it's the same thing. If it's at 8.0 or above, that's usually good. If it's lower, your SPS corals will snap more easily. But if a piece breaks off, that doesn't mean it dies. You just stick it back in the colony and let it become more bushy. So never sacrifice a piece. All right. Let's come back here. When it comes to placement, you've purchased some type of SPS coral from your fish store or from a hobbyist, or you did a trade, or you just got a gift. The first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to dip it in some kind of a chemical dip to avoid any kind of pests getting into your aquarium. Now, there are different products on the market, and I've used probably 10 or 12 of them over the years. I really like Revive. I've been using that for a long time. But there's also Bug Out from Fritz that I use. And I have used the dip from Fauna Marin. I have used, I mean, there's been different products. And any of them will give you the instructions on how to dip. And I've done videos about this. And even just not too long ago, I did a video talking about if you're dipping corals, make sure that you only dip them as long as the instructions say. So if the instructions say, you know, no more than 10 minutes, and you put 5 frags in the bucket, then the 5th frag needs to come out at 10 minutes. It can't be the first one comes out at 10 minutes and then the second one's at 11 minutes and the next one, because by the time you get to the 5th coral, it could be 16, 17 minutes later, and now you've burned the coral. It's been in contact with the dip too long. So put them all in the solution, blow them off during the, so you've got your frags. You've got them inside this bucket of dip, whatever you're using. You've got a turkey baster and you're blowing it off from different angles every few minutes during the 10-minute dip. And then you remove them from the dip immediately and put them all in a bucket of tank water. So you grab another bucket, another gallon of water or half gallon from your tank, and just let them rinse off in some aquarium water inside a second bucket. Now you can take your time with placement or whatever you're going to do, but they're not sitting in the dip. Go ahead and now if you have more corals to dip, you can put more in the dip and continue the process because the dip is good for a few hours. But then when you're done, you need to pour it out. And usually that can just go down the sink or down the toilet. The corals that you've dipped, you have different choices. You could leave it on the frag plug, which many people do, but there are some hobbyists that choose to cut the frag right off the frag plug and just keep the frag itself because they don't want anything on the plug. They're just terrified of any kind of pests, or they don't like that there's algae growing around the base, and they're thinking absolutely not putting that in my tank, and so they're preventative that way. Now, if you have a separate frag tank, you could take the frag plug that you cut the coral off of and put it in there, and then maybe the cleanup crew will clean off the algae. Maybe the dip will have helped weaken the algae to where it dies off. But if there's any tissue still left on the frag plug, you might get another frag in 6 to 9 months. It could grow into something. So rather than just throwing the plug away, maybe put in a separate tank where it has a chance to, whatever was remaining, to turn into another coral, and you'd have a bonus frag. So don't waste things if you don't have to. Now that you've got your frag and you're ready to put in your tank, it has to be, like Dwayne said, bolted down. If the coral is not secure, if it's rocking back and forth in the flow, and I'm not talking about a soft coral, I'm talking about a rigid coral. A rigid coral needs to be secure to the rockwork, because if it's secure, it grows. And when it's rocking back and forth, the coral's unsure of itself, basically, and it just doesn't grow as quickly. It kind of sits there, and it might even stagnate. And then you're thinking, man, I bought that a year ago. It's done nothing. And sometimes you're going to buy a coral that does nothing. It just does nothing. And then one day it just suddenly takes off. So as long as there's some, what I call SPS DNA, I never give up on a coral. I'm like, there's always a polyp left. One polyp can become many. So I never really give up on anything. I always give it a fighting chance to go. But if you're putting them in the tank and you're gluing them down, or you're using 2-part, mixed up putty to secure it on the rock, you'll have better success. There are different views on how to plant the corals in your tank. There's different viewpoints on where to put the corals in the tank. I did want to grab a picture for you guys of something. So I'll pull that up while I'm telling you this. But, an SPS coral, a frag of Acropora, for example, could be standing straight up off the rock, or you could lay it down on the frag plug. And maybe what'll happen is on that horizontal plane of the coral, you may get little bumps that grow up into little branches. You might get like 4 branches off of a single. So there is that opportunity. And some aquaculture fragging businesses will do that because they want to maximize how many frags they grow. All right, so let's see if this will work. Of course not. Of course it doesn't know my password. It's like that every time I need something fast. I'm sure you're used to that too. 1 second here. Oh, let's see if it works. It did. What do you know? Remember me? All right. I want to talk about Ooh, I like this. I might just grab a screen grab of this. It'll be so much easier than anything else. Okay, we got it. We got it. We're ready. All right. Once the coral's been glued down in your tank, it doesn't mean you can't move it again. So here's my approach when it comes to SPS corals, and I've been doing this like this forever. I get a brand new coral, I dip it. As soon as I come home, I dip it, and then I put it down I put it in the tank down at the bottom on the sand. I will just stand it right there in the substrate. Or if you happen to have something nifty like this cute little pumpkin frag rack that holds one frag, I got this as a gift yesterday. You could set this down into this. Oh, it's even got spider webs right here. You could set it down into the sand and then put the frag into the hole and just leave it alone for a week or so. And the benefit of leaving it alone, just letting it be, is that you got your hands off of it. The coral has been through a dip, so it's been chemically affected for a brief duration. And now, of course, your hermit crabs are going to come touch it. Your fish are going to smell it or nip at it slightly just to see if it might be food. And the coral has to get acclimated to your reef, to your flow, to the flavor of the chemicals of the water. Because not only is there water chemistry, but there's coral chemistry in the aquarium that could affect that coral, and it needs to adapt to all these new conditions it wasn't experiencing wherever it was before it got to you. Now, the coral is sitting on the bottom of the tank in my reef for about a week or so, maybe 2. And then at that point, I can reach down into the tank and I can move it to a new spot, like the ideal spot. Now, I'm saying now too much. Now I'm totally aware that I'm saying that. When you are choosing where to put this coral, there's a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, you need an ideal spot where it's going to get light and it's going to get flow. But you also need to make sure you don't put it near something of the same color, because invariably I do that all the time. I get this brand new acro. I'm like, oh, it's so gorgeous. I love it. Look at it. And it's glowing green, right? Like, let's just say it's a green slimer. And or the Acropora youngae. So I take that and I think I'm going to put it right in this spot. That is the perfect spot, and it's right next to 3 other green corals. So I can't even see it. It's gone. It's invisible. It has become part of the forest of green, and I have done that more times than I care to admit. It is a terrible flaw of mine, and so I have now tried to be way more cognizant of where I'm placing corals, or even mapping out a new location. Like, I have to put it in there. I need to cut something or move something to put this green one over here to balance out the coloration of the tank. So that is something that you do not want to forget about. Color. There's a color wheel system that people use. I've seen people do videos on this topic. But basically, if you look at the color wheel, it's a circle, right? And if green is here, there's something opposing it on the other end. Maybe it's orange. I don't know. So you would put those 2 colors near each other because they I can't even think of the word. They benefit each other. It looks better to the human eye. If you have all the same similar colors near there was times where my tank, here are all the browns, here are all the blues, here are all the greens, and the tank was just kind of boring and ugly. But when I learned to use that opposing color off the color wheel, it made a big difference in the appearance of the tank. Now, as the tank gets more and more full, like you saw in that video, it doesn't even matter anymore, because now you've got, let's say, in my tank it's pretty big, so I probably have like 10 dominant corals. But in a smaller tank, like the 29 gallon that I had for 7 years, I probably had 5 dominant corals that took over all the real estate in the aquarium. And, I could put in 50 corals, but 5 win and they kill everything else. So, and, invariably the things killing it are going to be the anemones, the mushrooms, fast-growing corals like zinnia and anthilia. Again, soft corals, they grow over things and just smother them. They just cover them up with their skin. And then the previous coral, or the weaker coral, the slower coral, just gets destroyed by its aggressive neighbor. So you want to keep that in mind. If you have a coral in your tank that you've planted and you've glued into a spot and it's not doing well, you could always relocate it to a new spot. It might do better in a different area in the tank because of the difference of flow. And literally it could be the flow, or it could be the flow of whatever's coming off of its neighbor. So if you have a blue tort here, and then you have a Montipora here, and the Montipora is just doing nothing, and the powerhead's way over there, it could just be the chemical coming off the blue tort is just scaring this thing to where it won't grow. I know that's not the right terminology, but it's just something's up. So sometimes just moving it to a totally different spot, the coral may take off and get going. Sometimes if you frag the coral that's doing nothing, it will suddenly say, oh, I better do something, and it gets going. It's just one of those crazy things that happens in our aquariums. We know a lot, but we don't know everything. Now, let's talk about lighting. Lighting in the aquarium is really, really important. And I mentioned earlier, you may have a light fixture that's just not strong enough. I told you guys this little light that's over the 1 gallon tank may not be enough to support any life. But I have seen lots of little examples of that tank with all kinds of pretty corals in there, and it's using that light. So the fact that the light is made of LED, it's an LED fixture, and it's closer to the water, it's not way up high, like 12 inches high, it has more intensity. It is providing some good light into the tank. And if it's white light, it's going to penetrate better than blue light. So if you're using a white light over the tank, you can expect good growth, but the coloration's going to be kind of blah. And if you use blue lighting, you get the pretty glow, but the growth will be slower. So I wanted to talk about lighting because that is an important factor that has been really maligned over the last 5 years or so. So here is a screenshot of my lighting schedule that I use. I use the sky over my reef tank, and I'm going to make this a little smaller so you can see all of it. And you can see that my clock starts at 11:30. That's when the light turns on. And then by 11:30 at night, it's off. But what I want you to really appreciate here, it's 12 hours a day because yes, there's light on the tank for 12 hours a day, but really just from 15 o'clock, 3 o'clock to 6:30. So for 3.5 hours, I have what I call high noon. And that is when my lights are running at 80%. And when I do the 80%, I'm using the coral growth choice in the spectrums provided by the sky. Now, coral growth tends to be kind of in the whiter look. It's not the pretty blue that you like. And so if you look at that list on the bottom, you'll see that it starts and ends with sunset. And then at noon, my tank has the all blue hue. And then also at 11 o'clock at night, it's all blue. But I have a custom color that's at 1 o'clock that also happens again at 8:30. And then, of course, I have the coral growth, which is going to be more in the white spectrum. And that's when I'm really pounding the reef with white light for about 3.5 hours. And I've been doing this for a super long time. This bell curve has worked out really, really well over my reef. I've done that with metal halides previous to this, but I've now had the sky, I think, 3.5 years over my tank. The growth has been phenomenal. I am actually blown away with how fast the tank grew in under the LED lighting because I was a big metal halide fan. But I've never been a fan of running your lights full strength for 10 to 12 hours a day. I am recommending a much shorter period. And so a lot of times I tell people you really only need your lights to run about 9 hours a day. This little tank, the 1 gallon of the white light, I think I've got that set to 5 hours of light a day. The rest of the time it gets light either from the windows, daylight, or it's just dark. And that's just how that's going to work for that tank. I don't need it to be lit a long time because I'm keeping a fish in there. And I may add 1 or 2 other things, but the 5 hours of white light will be plenty per day. That's all it's going to need, and it will grow whatever is in that tank as long as the water parameters are maintained. The tank behind it there, that one is running, I think, from 2 o'clock to 11 o'clock, so that is 9 hours a day. Caitlin's Reef is basically the same schedule, too. The Frag tank is even a little bit less. I think it's 3 o'clock to 10:30. So you can go longer, but there's only so much. You guys have heard of photosynthesis, right? You went to school and you learned this in biology class. Well, photosynthesis happens during a certain amount of hours, and then it stops. no matter if there's still daylight. It doesn't just keep photosynthesizing. It just stops and rests. And if there was like intense light that continued, it would actually wear out the plant. Well, the algae that's inside of our SPS corals, the zooxanthellae, it's a symbiotic algae. It does the same thing. It converts the light into sugars. The sugar gives the coral energy, the energy to grow itself and make itself more, increase its mass. But then at one point it gets worn out and it just can't do anything more. So keeping the lights running longer for yourself doesn't necessarily benefit it. I know people want to see the lights in the tank when they wake up and they want it to go all the way to when they go to bed. But really, maybe you don't need to do that. Or maybe you just put on some dim lighting early in the morning just for your, for the 10 to 30 minutes you're looking at the tank before you go to work, and then let it cycle off, and then really have your lights come on around 11:30 or 12 and let it do its thing. And then you come home from work at 5 or 6 and you enjoy your tank until, whatever, midnight. But you could reduce the time period. And by reducing the time period of your lighting for the aquarium, you can reduce the propensity of having algae growing in the aquarium that you don't want. Because algae is going to steal space in your aquarium. If you have SPS corals in your tank that are doing well, and your lighting schedule is whatever it is now, I'm not saying you should change your schedule. You could shorten it and probably not see any impact whatsoever on the aquarium. But if you are having I'm basically saying if it's going successfully, leave it as is. Don't change anything. But if you're trying something out and you're trying to figure it out, or you've never done this before and you're learning from this video and a few others, then just know you do not need 12 hours of light per day for your aquarium. That's really important. Basically, you don't want to overdo it. And definitely do not be scared of white lighting. That was a thing that I was saying has been misleading people for some time now. I've seen a lot of posts where people say, there's no white light in the ocean, you don't need white light, blue is what the corals need, you only need blue, and that's very misleading, it's very inaccurate. The fact is that while there are blue spectrums down, the deeper you go into the ocean, the sun is white. It's all spectrums, but it's white. It's 6,500 Kelvin, generally speaking. And then as the light penetrates through the water, it becomes dimmer and dimmer. So with less light, it may look bluer to our eyes, but the water is still clear all the way down. The water doesn't turn blue. So I've been diving for a while, and when I dive, I go down to about 120 feet. I've seen corals growing down that deep. I've seen corals growing at 30 feet. I've dove, in Fiji and the Florida Keys, and I've seen the difference of looks. But ultimately, it's that beautiful daylight look that gives these corals what they look like. But then we've been supplementing with blue because it makes it look even more glowy. It's prettier. And if you want to grow big colonies like the one I was showing you here, if that's what you want to do, daylight is your friend. If you put a tank just blue light on top, that's going to take forever to get to that point, where I did this in a couple of years. And, my tank is turning 11 years old next November. Next month, right? No, in 2 months. So it's an old tank. But when I reset it with Dwayne, we took everything off the top. We removed all the skeletal stuff. We saved fist-sized pieces of my corals and planted them here, there, and everywhere. And then we just sat back and let it go. Well, me. I sat back and let it go. And my tank lives in spite of me. It just continues to do its thing. Most of it is automated, and it does quite well. But I remember having someone over who was a huge coral collector. He had 1,000 frags in his tank, and it was a big tank, and it had 1,000 frags. I mean, seriously, I'm not exaggerating. There was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. I mean, there probably was literally 1,000 frags. And when he came to my house and he looked at my corals, he said, I've never seen acroporas so big before. And I was looking at my tank thinking, you think this is big? This is nothing. I've seen monster colonies. I've been impressed by other people's tanks many, many times that have grown giant colonies. And I'm happy to have something large that's 12 inches across or 15 inches across or 8 inches tall or 12 inches tall. That's cool. But the reality is, you can definitely grow big corals from those fragments. But in his tank, he only used blue light each day, and everything was small, and he was constantly fragging his frags to sell them to get more from other people or to make money. And so he was not even seeing this side of the hobby. And I think it's an unfortunate situation. We want to grow. We want to do so good at our tank that it gets too full, that we've done such a good job that we have no more space. And matter of fact, in this next issue of Coral Magazine, the aquarium portrait talks about a person who had a smaller tank and his corals grew so quickly, he immediately needed to upgrade to a much larger tank just to enjoy the hobby because it just wasn't going to work in a nano. It just couldn't work. All right. Let's talk about water parameters, and I want to emphasize something. I talk about water testing every Saturday. I always tell you guys to do this. If you want to keep SPS corals, you need to test your water weekly. You can, or even more frequently, honestly. The more you test the water, the more likely you'll maintain stability in the aquarium for the SPS corals. So if you want Montipore, if you want Acropore, if you want Bird's Nest, which is actually not Acropore at all, it's something Hystrix. I forget the Latin right now. I should know it, but I don't know it by heart. I have to look it up to know these things. If you're trying to keep these small polyp stony corals in your aquarium, you need to have really, really stable water. So we'll start at the top of the list, alkalinity. The general rule for saltwater aquariums, well, actually, let's start at the top, salinity. The first thing you put in water is salt when you want to start the tank and cycle it, right? Your salinity needs to be 35 ppt. That's 1.0265 specific gravity. Whether you're using a refractometer or a hydrometer or what else? What else could you use? Those are the couple that are most prevalent in our hobby. We want to make sure, and then like I was saying, specific gravity versus ppt, parts per trillion. We want to know what that number is, and we want to get as close to 35 ppt for the corals. Fish stores tend to keep their fish section at 1.019. They may keep their corals at 1.023. A lot of hobbyists say, well, I like to keep mine like 1.024. I don't want to go to 1.026. I don't know why. Why do you not want to be at 35 ppt? 35 is the number. And they're like, well, what if my salt gets too high? Well, that's why we test weekly. It'll never happen if you're on top of it. If your tank is being topped off daily a few times a day through automation, your salinity will stay the same because the water evaporates and the salt doesn't. So if you're trying to choose a salinity level for a tank that's going to have SPS corals, 35 ppt. Can you do it a little lower? Yes. Is there a benefit? No. There's no benefit. There is no benefit whatsoever to be 1.024. Okay? So just get up to 1.026 and keep it there and top off your tank, hopefully automatically. If you have a smaller tank like this one, they have these things that clip on the rimless part of the tank, and you screw on a 2-liter bottle and just let it blubble in the water as the evaporation occurs, and it breaks the siphon and blobs in some water and maintains salinity. It's that easy. That tank right there behind me has a bucket underneath in the cabinet with some tubing that rises up with a pump and a sensor and all that kind of stuff, and I refill the bucket once a week, and it just tops off automatically. The little tiny tank right here, that one, I have to grab a little tiny cup, a urine specimen cup, and I take, 40 milliliters of RODI water, and I just pour it in the back filtration, and that, because that little tank actually evaporates despite the lid. I'm very surprised. I was thinking with that lid, evaporation will be nil, but it actually has been evaporating more than I expected. Doesn't matter. You add the water, you maintain the salinity. That's all that matters. Alkalinity. So SPS corals use alkalinity to grow. They use the alkaline from the water. I hope I said that correctly. I know they use alkalinity, so let me just stick with that word because I'm familiar with it. They use that to make their stony skeleton, and they grow tissue over. So the skeleton itself is one size. The skin growing over it will be, at the very tips, will be whitish. And people think, oh, is my coral dying? It's like, no, that's new growth. That's a good thing. And underneath it, it is using calcium ions and alkalinity ions, carbonates, to make more skeleton so that the stick becomes longer and longer and longer and longer. And so as the tip is growing, there's a mouth at the very tip, and the polyp's eating some food, and all the polyps down the side of the stem. Here, let's put a picture of a coral back up there again. Let's do this one here. This is a good one. Let me find that perfect one. Let's use this one. So that right there, this tip is not white, it's more greenish, but that's okay. Maybe under white light, it would look a little more whitish. I'm trying to make this big enough I can let us appreciate it. So this acropora here has multiple mouths on it, and all those mouths are trying to capture food. And we're going to get into that. That's coming up in the next section, in 2 sections. We're talking about water primers right now. But the tip itself, where it's growing brand new, it tends to be whitish. And then after some time happens, the symbiotic zooxanthellae algae within its tissue will start to gain some color. And that's where the coloration comes from. And so you've got skeletal growth, you've got new skin that is now getting new zooxanthellae. It is consuming food from the water column, and it is growing, and it's a constant process. It keeps happening and happening. And at the base of the acropora, you may end up see that it becomes more shaded, because the colonies become bigger, and so there's a giant shadow, and it's not getting light at the base, and the base may actually start to die off. And that is also something to be expected. Does it look good? No. Do we prefer it? Absolutely not. Is there a way to avoid it? Not really. But if you have if you want, at some point down the road, you can take out the colony, you can cut off the dead part underneath and replant it low to create room for it to keep growing upward again. So you can keep doing that. But the alkalinity, so the general rule is to be somewhere between 8 and 11 DKH. I tend to keep my tank at 9.5. There are some people that like to keep their tank much lower. They like to keep it closer to 7 DKH, which I think is insane. But it does work, and there are people there with beautiful tanks maintaining a much lower alkalinity level. I just like 9.5. It's been my number for a long time. It used to be higher, and I went down to 9.5, and I'm good there. So 9 to 9.5 is where my tank tends to be. I have the Trident hooked up to my tank, which measures it 4 times a day, and I can just open the app and take a look and see where my numbers are. And like right now, my tank is at 9.03, so it's at 9.0. That's fine. If it gets lower, like 8.5, I get a notification warning me, and then I check and see if I need to put more media in the reactor and bring it back up again. So, but the point is, you want to have a number and you want to stick to it as close as possible for stability reasons. The next number we care about is calcium. This should be somewhere between 375 and 450. My tank tends to stay at 400. A few years ago when I was dosing trace elements, I was also dosing some calcium carbonate intentionally, some very concentrated from Reef Blueprint. And I got it up to 420. And I was like, all right, so that's good. I mean, I just did not want to dip down to 380 and lower. I definitely don't want to be in the 360s. You want to be at some number. And so I'm picking a number and sticking as close as I can to it on a regular week-by-week basis. So we've got alkalinity at 9.0. We've got calcium at 400. Those are my 2 numbers. And then magnesium, I like to have mine at no less than 1300. I tend to lean more toward 1400. And right now, the Trident is telling me that my calcium is measuring 414, so really 410. And it's saying that my magnesium is at 1450, but I think that number might be a little bit high. I might be a little bit lower. Now, the nice thing is, from time to time, and I haven't done it in a while, when I send off an ICP test, I will get a result that tells me the calcium level and the magnesium level. I don't believe they give me alkalinity, but at least I can compare some of these numbers to my home test kit and just see if they're close enough to each other. Phosphate. Phosphate, for a long time, it was always recommended to be 0.03, which is super low. And they said this is the ideal optimum condition for SPS corals. And so that was our goal, to get to 0.03. And we'd use GFO and other means to remove phosphate from the water column to keep it low so that the corals would be colorful. But realistically, I know lots of people, including Rich Ross, who you guys know from Reef Beef, who his tank tends to be 1.0, and his tank is gorgeous. I mean, it's beautiful. Everyone wants his tank. So phosphates are not something to be worried about. In my opinion, they're easy to control. I use Phosphate RX to remove the phosphate buildup. I just did it in my tank a couple days ago, and I haven't measured yet today, but I know they're lower than they were. Oh, wait, I got it right here. The Trident NP is telling me it's 0.14. So it's kind of low. So I was going to say, if you want to shoot for a good goal for phosphate levels with SPS corals, shoot for 0.1 or below. That would be fine. The higher your phosphate level, the more likelihood of having algae growth in your tank, the nuisance algae. And then if it gets too high, it can actually stagnate or stunt coral growth entirely. The corals just stop growing, or it gets so high that it actually impregnates, I guess that's the right word, it impregnates rock and sand, and then when you do use something to remove the phosphate from the water, it keeps coming back because it keeps leaching out of the rock and the sand, and so you knocked it down and the level rises rapidly, and you knock it down and it rises rapidly because it keeps leaching out. But if you keep using whatever media you're going to use to remove phosphate from the water column, at one point you will get all of it out of the system, including everything out of the rock and sand. Now, your sand bed itself may need to be vacuumed to remove a lot of trapped detritus in there, which could be part of your phosphate battle. So don't neglect that job. That's something that you should, stay on top of. And if you have a tank that has no sand at all, then you should be siphoning out the detritus that's blowing around and getting stuck under the rocks or getting blown in the back corner. Got to get it out of the system. Remove it, and that will help maintain the lower phosphate level in your tank. The foods you use in your feeding your tank can add to the phosphate level. If you're feeding a lot of nori to the tank, phosphate's going to go up and up and up because you're putting in sheets of phosphate into the tank because you're trying to keep your tanks nice and healthy. And the more fish load you have, the more likelihood of higher nutrient levels in the tank because all the fish have to eat. But at the same time, a tank that has no fish in it tends to have very pale, unhealthy corals, which is why so often you see people with frag systems, and once they add a few fish to it, and they're feeding those fish, those corals end up looking a lot healthier in the system. They really do work hand in hand. And where there are corals, there's fish, and where there are no corals, there are no fish, and I'm talking about in nature. So when an entire reef dies off for whatever reason, whether it's heat or pollution, runoff, storms that devastate it, wherever there's nothing, the fish aren't there, there's also no coral growth. And then you just get algae growth. So instead, you go find a spot that has anything sitting on the substrate. I'm talking about as a diver. You are diving out there and you swim across this open expanse of sand, and finally you find a rock, some object on the sand, and you dive down closer and there's fish hanging out by it because it's a structure and they're calling it home. And then you swim out further and you get to more of a structure, and you'll see corals and fish, and they're working hand in hand. The fish use the corals as protection to hide inside or to look for a food source. There's a lot going on there, but they work in tandem. So your reef tank needs to have the right amount of fish to have a good biological balance, but not so much so that you have to feed so much that your water quality is poor, because SPS corals are going to demand a higher quality water parameter situation. Nitrates should be below 10 ppm. It used to be you need to be like 2 or 3, but really anything under 20 is going to be just fine. And if it's higher, like mine tends to be, you just saw my tank, it's full of corals, my nitrates are way higher right now. And I have some little news. So yesterday, a club member who I met back in 2002, he was the vice president of DFW Mass. And he called me up a couple days ago and said, hey, I just got a greenhouse installed behind my home. And the person that was installing the polycarbonate sheeting cut it all by hand and it looks terrible. Can you cut me nicer pieces because you work with acrylic? And I said, yeah, I've got a CNC machine. We can put the pieces on there and we can cut it out. And so he says, okay. So he showed up with some brand new polycarbonate, and he showed up with the 2 pieces he removed. And the pieces were hand cut with a utility knife. And the cuts were really bad. They were ugly, and there was even, he pointed out to me, there was a point like in the middle of the sheet where he had kneeled to cut, and it had put a dent in the sheeting. And he says, look at this. I'm like, yeah, I see it. I get it. I understand. So we put everything on Minion. Minion cut out the pieces, and he left. But he left me with some goodies. And one of the things he gave me, which was really a nice surprise, and it's filthy as can be, he gave me an old calcium reactor that he used to use. It's I think it's a Corallin. I believe that's the brand. And the funny thing is, I mean, it's been sitting in probably his garage for many years. It still has the media in it and the water in it. So I'm not looking forward to opening that up. It's going to smell horrible because, stagnant water. I need to have that ready to dump somewhere. But I'm going to clean it out, and I'm going to fill it up with some sulfur media, and I'm going to start denitrating my tank with that. And then I can feed my tank as much as I want because I want it to worry about nitrate. But the reason I'm talking about nitrates so much, I talk about it, and I know where it's coming from. It's not even coming from my feeding. It's coming from me neglecting the algae turf scrubber because I can't get to it because there's a tank in the way because I haven't set up the anemone cube, which is my fault, but there's only so many hours in the day, and I have not had the time to tackle it. And I keep thinking this will be the week I do it, and then my week does not work out. Other things happen, and I don't get to it. But my tank is full of corals, and my tank has a bunch of nitrate. So I want you to understand that SPS corals can tolerate a lot. Is it ideal? No. Could you start losing things? Yes. So we want to get our water parameters in a good spot, and we want to stay on top of it with water testing. And by doing this, you can have better success growing these corals. If you set up a tank and it cycles properly, and then you add a few fish, and then finally you start planting corals in there, and you have good lighting and you have good flow, you can have really pretty SPS corals. It's not impossible. It's just you need to find out what is going wrong that is causing the SPS corals not to do well for you. And I'm referring to the person way earlier that had said, it doesn't matter. Every time I put one in my tank, it dies. Well, why is it dying? What exactly is happening? And once you figure out what it is, you can make that correction, and then you can put another piece in that does completely well, and then you start going down this trail of getting more and more and more of them, so you can have a really pretty tank. Another thing that's really important in stability of a tank is going to be temperature. And maintaining temperature would be keeping it as close as possible to maybe a 1 degree swing. My tank tends to swing 1 degree. 1.1 degree is my swing for the day. Yesterday in the 24-hour period, I went from 76.8 to 77.9. And that's a great tiny margin. A lot of people's tanks tend to swing about 2 degrees per day. Meaning during the peak of the day with the lights on and everything's going on, the tank's a little warmer, and then during the night when the lights are off and the flow may be slower and the house is cooler, the tank cools off a little bit. And a 2 degree swing is okay. A 4 degree, 5 degree, 7 degree swing is terrible for SPS corals, and they can't tolerate it. You may have a tank full of softies right now and never thought about temperature at all, but when you put in SPS, you're going to want to lock in those numbers and really keep it super tight. And one of the more obvious ways of maintaining a temperature of your tank is to have a chiller hooked up, and then of course have heaters hooked up. And the heaters will keep the tank warm enough, and the chiller will keep the tank cool enough. And between those two items, your tank stays nice and stable. Now I choose, instead of running a chiller, I keep my house the right temperature all the time, which tends to be about 72 to 74 degrees. That's where my house is all the time. And then my tank itself has it has 3 cooling fans that are blowing down on the sump if the tank gets too hot, which almost never happens. Occasionally it does, but almost never. But if there was a need, the apex will then say, turn on the fans, and they blow down on the water. And if the tank continues to get hot, like during Markna last year when the power was out and the house was 88 degrees in the living room, I had Dwayne run down to the fish store. I had him run down to 7-Eleven and buy a bunch of bags of ice, and basically I probably spent $80 in ice, right? And I put in 4 bags into the sump. 4 bags of ice. I put those in the sump, and that brought the temperature down a little bit, and they melted probably in 20-30 minutes. Removed the saggy bag of water, and then put in 4 more bags. And that was it. It kept the tank from getting over 79 degrees in a house that was 88. Got very lucky. I'm just glad I realized what was happening because I kind of forgot about it. I was busy doing a 24-hour live stream. I was not looking at my tank. I was thinking about the camera and the interviews and the next person and what goes on the screen and the next slide and all the kind of things I had to do. And I was not thinking about the reef until suddenly it hit me probably around 5 o'clock. I was like, oh! And I did a quick, I did a quick thing with Dwayne and said, hey, I need you to go take my keys, get 7-Eleven, get the ice, and stick it in there. And then after the power came on, I was actually able to see what the Apex had recorded, because the Apex had, everything was working off generator power. That was fine. But I didn't have a way to talk to it because there's a hub between my modem that was plugged in the generator, and the tank was on a generator, but that hub was powerless. The hub was under my TV, and I didn't need to use the TV that day. And so I couldn't get the communication I needed to look at it on my phone and know. But I was able to look it up later because the Apex tracks everything, and it gives you, what's happened now, and of course, every hour before, and it actually goes back 3 months. It's 90 days worth of data. So having heaters is what keeps my tank from getting too cold at night, even though I keep the house nice and cool. And then during the daytime, I rely on the fans or just keeping the room temperature correct. But if the tank were to get too hot, then I just go to ice packs. I don't use a chiller, number one, because of the electricity consumption. I don't feel like paying for it. And number two, I don't like the heat that comes off of the chiller that's going to make the room warmer. Because think about it, you've got your aquarium in the room with a chiller, and the chiller's operational, so the tank water is nice and cool, 77 degrees or whatever, 78. But the room gets warmer and warmer the longer the chiller runs. And as the room gets warmer, the chiller has to run more to make sure that the tank doesn't get warmer. So it's kind of a crazy cycle when you think about it. So I've never used a chiller. But when we had that big power outage, I was thinking, man, I wish I had a chiller right now because I wouldn't have to worry about the tank. It would be fine. It would just be running in autopilot mode. But it's a big tank. I would need a really big chiller. I need a spot for it. And I've just chosen not to do that because I've never needed it. All right. The next thing you wanted, or the final thing I would say that you should know about when it comes to SPS corals, and I mentioned strontium earlier, but potassium is a really important one. And while there are a couple of potassium test kits on the market, and Saliford is the one that people seem to like the best, really the quickest way to know what your potassium level is to do an ICP test, because you'll get the number and then you'll be able to do the math and figure out how much you need to add to your tank to get it up where it needs to be. We want to be at 400 ppm minimum. That's a big number. I never really thought about it until I was really thinking about it. And potassium is so important for coloration of SPS corals. So if you're buying high dollar SPS corals because you're like, oh, I love that this is purple, I love that this is orange, I love this is green, and this one's blue, and this one's this, and you're getting all these, but then you don't have the right potassium level, they're all going to become pale and blah. But as soon as you get the potassium back into the water, they get colorful. And there's other trace elements that also come into play. That ICP test is everything. It gives you all these numbers to tell you if you need strontium, if you need boron, if you need cesium, if you need vanadium, if you need manganese. I mean, yes, you can go crazy adding all kinds of stuff to really soup up your tank and get some fantastic coloration. That doesn't mean you have to, because there was some incredible tank of the months back in the early 2000s, and we didn't have ICP testing, and we were just pouring in whatever we could buy that was in a bottle. So if you bought a bottle of trace elements, it would say on the bottle it has all these, and you knew that it was watered down, and you're just putting in a capful or whatever each week and hoping it makes a difference, but not really knowing. And these tanks were gorgeous. So we now have machinery that can give us precise numbers, and we can buy individual trace elements and concentrate and add those to our tank on a daily basis and really dial in the coloration and have some fantastic stuff. But you can have an acropore like this one on my screen next to me in a tank with just salt water with the right water parameters. And if you're changing water frequently and the water's not full of nutrients, you can have beautiful SPS corals in your tank. Let's talk about flow now. The flow in your aquarium for an SPS coral needs to be chaotic. And chaotic means that you have power or flow from this power head hitting flow from this power head. They interact with each other and they go all different directions. If you use the random flow generators like I use in my 400-gallon reef, they blow. They don't just go one direction into the tank. They actually come in at 5 different areas, completely random. There's no moving parts. It's magic, and it works so well. And I'm telling you, if you haven't used one, once you hook it up in your tank, you'll be like, wow, I needed this. Now, the random flow generator has to be under the water about 4 inches minimum, or it might siphon air down into the fitting and blow air bubbles into your tank. If we look at my tank again here, those 2 random flow generators are just to the right of the vortex there on the right side of the tank, above the hammer coral. And the water is, you can see how the water is doing that weird ripple right there above it. That's because it keeps changing. The flow is pointing straight up sometimes and blowing up and creating that surge that you see. And then it's blowing downward toward the hammer, so the hammer's got some pulse. And then it's blowing toward the aquapora, it's blowing toward Spock. But it's constantly changing, and there's 2 of them. So there's nice, chaotic, random changing flow all the time. The vortex, I have 3 of them on my tank. There's 2 MP60s on the left, and there's that MP40 in the back that you can see on the back glass. And those are all in reef crest mode during most of the daytime, and so the flow is increasing and decreasing, and it's constantly moving, but it's not just laminar. Laminar flow in a reef tank doesn't benefit most corals. It can be great for sea fans. I mean, that's what that coral needs. But for the types of corals we tend to keep, the more chaotic, the better. So that's what I would recommend to you, is to put in multiple power heads that are at different angles, blowing in different directions, hopefully blowing toward each other to create some cavitation and crisscross flow. And that will help your corals grow outward into nice big bushy corals and not just have them all lean to the left or all lean to the right, because the flow is blowing the coral that direction. The flow in the aquarium will help keep the corals clean, but that doesn't mean you should ignore them, because like we were talking about the plating Montipora species, they come in a coil, right? And that plate can trap detritus. And if you're not blowing if you don't have enough flow to keep it clean, you need to take a turkey baster and blow it out at least once a week. Because if you ignore it and the detritus builds up in the center, that will smother the life underneath it. And then when you blow it out, there's a dead spot. And where the dead spot is, you can get an algae spot. And then when the algae grows, it wants to spread. And as it spreads, it starts shading the SPS coral. The polyps are starting to die off, and the algae gets further and further. It's a whole thing. So instead, you want to make sure that the coral stays nice and clean and let it continue to coil and be beautiful. But you're going to have to go in there and either, like I said, a power head is another choice. But the turkey baster is the easiest one to grab rapidly. Depends on the size of your aquarium. If you want to hold a power head and just blow off all the different corals in the tank once a week, you totally can. That will help get rid of trapped detritus and get in the water column, so it can be trapped in a filter sock, or it can be trapped in a fleece roller, or it can just get removed from the protein skimmer, or it could just settle out in your sump where you need to pump it out later on. Also, the flow in your tank brings food to the corals. So when you put in, and we're talking about food now, so when you put food in the tank and it blows around, all those little mouths, those thousands upon thousands of little flowery polyps, they're all trying to capture specks of food from the water column. And if you have food, if you didn't have the flow in the tank and you just had the stick standing up and there was no water blowing across it, how is the food that you put in the tank over here going to get on all those little polyps? And if you take the food and you just drizzle it down on top of that aquapora, will the polyps be able to grab it before it settles to the bottom? So we want to have flow moving through the tank all the time when we're putting food in the aquarium. And a lot of people like to stop all the flow in the tank. Now, there are times when you should, especially if you're trying to target feed LPS corals. For the SPS, they really need the flow happening. And they'll feed during the daytime, but they'll definitely feed during the nighttime when the fish are asleep, because they can extend their polyps way farther out than you normally see while the lights are on. So at night, they really extend out, they open wide, they really try to capture some food, and there's no chance that a fish or something's going to be picking at it and possibly damaging the polyp. The best thing you can use is broadcast food. Benereef is a great food that you can use in your tank, and you can use it frequently. It doesn't have problems with adding phosphate or nitrate to your tank, so you can feed all those SPS corals. You just mix it up in a cup of tank water. You let it sit for 5 minutes, set a timer on your watch. As soon as the timer elapses, you can turn off the return pump, but leave all the other pumps on in your tank. If you have gyres, vortex, maxi jets, J-bows, whatever it is you're using in your tank for in-tank flow, leave them running. And then pour in the Benarif powder formula, which has been sitting in salt water for 5 minutes. And what that does is it activates all the bacteria and everything that's in it as well. And it just goes through the whole tank and all those polyps everywhere. All my SPS corals are all snacking. Of course, the LPS are as well. You can feed everything in the tank with broadcast feeding. That is the beauty of it. When I feed my fish, I broadcast feed. I just pour it in the tank in multiple spots and let it go everywhere like a snow globe. And then, they hunt it all down, and within 2 minutes it's gone. But the Benarif powder, and there's other powders. I mean, there's Reefroids is another one that people like to use. And that one you can pour throughout the tank. It blows everywhere like snow, and everything in your tank gets a chance to eat it. You really can't target feed an SPS coral. That's why broadcast feeding is so important. And the broadcast feeding only needs your return pump off for about 10 minutes or so. And if you do this 2 or 3 times a week, your corals are all going to get a nice meal. They're all going to benefit from it. They're going to grow a little bit quicker, and you're going to get some really nice results. Another thing that the corals eat in the tank, and you might think it's kind of gross, is they eat the fish poop. So when you are feeding tangs and clownfish and whatever, that stuff that they poop out into the water column and it just immediately goes and blows everywhere, corals are going to eat it. So I actually don't try to keep a tank that's particulate free. A lot of people want that crystal clear, pristine water. They use ozone, they use UV, they use everything so that the water is clear, like pure RODI water. They want that look through their whole tank, and that's not natural. The reef always has flocculants. There's all in the natural reef. There's always things blowing around, and visibility is not always that great. There are times when visibility is incredible, and it's great for a scuba diver or for a snorkeler. It's great for photography. But to see a bunch of stuff in the water column, that's okay. And to have some stuff blowing around in my tank, I've never been thinking, there's times I wish it didn't happen, but most of the time, I think of it as a food source. Something in my tank is going to eat that, so I don't care. And I just let it happen. So if something blows around and something catches it, great. If it ends up getting sucked into the protein skimmer and gets collected in the collection cup, that's okay too. If it lands in a filter sock, that's okay too. I mean, whatever. But I'm not trying to have super pristine water all the time. But I really like pristine water before a photography session. So if because I don't normally run anything on my tank. I just have the skimmer running, and I've got the refugium, and I've got the algae turf scrubber. But if I wanted to take pictures tomorrow, I could install a filter sock and have all my drains go into a sock to really polish the water so it's really nice and clear for tomorrow. And I would also run carbon on the tank. And I'd put carbon inside a reactor and let that take out the tinge out of the water so that I have nice, clear water. I would clean the glass in my aquarium super well that day. Basically, you do all these things today, so then tomorrow, when I break out the camera and I start taking some really nice DSLR photographs, I have nice clear water, I have nice clear glass, everything works in my favor, and my life is so much easier. It's no fun trying to remove all the particulates from a photograph in Photoshop. It's too much work. I did talk about temperature briefly. I do want to emphasize that if you're trying to keep your tank temperature from getting too warm during the daytime, it could be something as simple as a big fan blowing down on the surface of the water plugged into a timer. And you could say, and you're going to have to figure it out. You have to find that sweet spot. But you might say, wow, in the summer, I need the fan to turn on at 10 in the morning. But in the winter, you might not need it to come on until 3 p.m. And it may only need to run until 8 p.m. and it's done. Just those 3 hours is just a little bit you needed to keep the water temperature stable. But when, like I said, when I had my 55-gallon aquarium and I had SPS corals in there and I wanted to keep the temperature stable, I had to run the fan from like 10 a.m. and it was blowing straight down. It was a big fan that I got from Walmart, and I stuck it on top of some egg crate, and the egg crate was sitting on top of the sump, and it just blew straight down in the water of the sump. And it was cooling the water through evaporation, and that fan had to run from like 10 in the morning till like 2 in the morning. It was a super long run. I did not need to run 24 hours. That would have been unnecessary. Now I would have been using the heaters to combat the fan. But like I said, I would use the fan during the long period for summer months, but then in the winter, I would just use it for a few hours because I was getting a lot of heat from the metal halides. And so I found that if I ran it around 5 o'clock in the evening, that was about the right time to start it. And by 8 o'clock, 8:30, I was basically done because the lights were turning off at 9:30, and it all just worked out. But having it plugged into a timer is one method. A better method is to have a controller in your tank, like the Apex or the Hydros or GHL or whatever it is you're using, that will turn on the fan based on the water temperature itself. So the controller says, ooh, the tank is 79 degrees. Turn on fan, turn on this outlet, and this outlet comes to life, and whatever's plugged in starts blowing, right? That's the idea. And that is a really easy thing to set up and will help you to stay on top of it. And you'll get notifications if the tank gets too warm. It literally comes up on your screen of your phone or your tablet or your computer, and you can be aware of it and deal with it. And with a controller, you can see the temperature all the time. You're not just getting just this second. You'll find out how the last day went. You can see if the temperature really rose crazily high or if it just kind of went up and came back down and went up and came back down. Because we want to be as steady as possible. And like I told you, my tank tends to be 1 degree swing. Now the heaters. I haven't heard this in a while, so I'm hoping that people have gotten away from it. But there was a period where BRS was really pushing that people buy these 2 800-watt heaters for their tank. And I thought, are you out of your mind? That is insane. And people are putting these on small tanks, like a 100-gallon tank. And they'd have 2 800-watt heaters in there. And they were saying, if my one 800-watt heater doesn't work, I have a backup. I have a second one in the system. 800 by itself was too much. Now you got 1600. That is so much amperage that it could trip the circuit breaker for your entire aquarium if it's just a normal common household outlet. I mean, there are places in your home where you may know I can't plug in a hairdryer or a vacuum cleaner or something that pulls a lot of power. Or you had to replace a circuit breaker just to be able to do it. And your aquarium has a lot of things plugged in, but the heater is the big one. We want to make sure we use the right water to heat to keep the tank from getting too cool so that the SPS corals will be okay. So if you go with the general rule of thumb that you need 3 watts per gallon, that's how much heater you need for your aquarium. So a 100-gallon tank needs a 300-watt heater, not an 800, and definitely not 2 elements that are 800 each. And if I was putting 300 watts on a 100-gallon tank, I would get 2 150-watt heaters. The reason being that if a 150-watt heater sticks in the on position and just won't turn off, it won't have the wattage to cook the aquarium. The odds of both sticking in the on position are less likely to happen. And if you have a controller on the aquarium, it can literally kill the power to the heaters. The outlet just goes dead because the tank got too warm. You set it up to like if tank water temperature 79.5, outlet 1 and 2 off. And then that's it. The outlet goes dead and the heater can't keep running no matter what. But the benefit of having smaller heaters side by side is really wise. If you have a heater that doesn't work, you'll know. Because again, the controller or the thermometer on the front of your tank will tell you the tank's getting too cool, and you could then investigate and say, hey, my heater died. I need to buy a new one. It's not that complicated. Having a new one in the closet or on the shelf is really how you should be anyway. So if your tank uses 300-watt heaters, and like I said, 250 watts or a 200 and a 100 or whatever you're going to use, whatever that math comes out to get you 300 watts for the 100-gallon tank, you should have an extra one handy. Maybe you use that when you're mixing a new batch of salt water and you need to bring that salt water to the right temperature. That's your third heater. So if one of the ones in your sump fails, you can just pull it out, grab the one you use for mixing salt water, stick it in the tank. Tank is fine and safe. Next time you go to the store, you can go buy another heater, and then you've got a new heater for your salt water. Also, I mentioned ice earlier for when I'm in a real pinch, which happens like once every couple of years as an emergency. But another trick that works for smaller tanks like this one here, you can keep 2 or 3 frozen 20-ounce bottles in your, get a 20-ounce bottle, fill it up with RODI water, put it in the freezer, and let it turn rock hard. You could use 2-liter bottles if you want, and you could freeze some of those for bigger tanks. And then when your tank is getting too warm, instead of putting in a big bag of ice, you could put in the frozen 20-ounce bottle or the frozen 2-liter bottle, and then as the bottle thaws, you put it back in the freezer and you grab another bottle out of the freezer and you put it in the tank, and you just cycle through these bottles to maintain that the tank doesn't get too warm. That's great for emergencies. It's one of those things. And also, the big bottles of frozen water in your freezer will help during a power outage from letting your food spoil because you have big blocks of ice inside the freezer. So as you borrow them, you're actually leaving some behind, which benefits your food that you plan to eat later. And I think, looking at my notes, I'll just add one more thing about generators, and then we're done. I believe, besides having quality gear on my tank, I use Vortec pumps because I trust them for flow. I don't have any weird things with electricity in the water. It just works out. It has been my go-to pump since 2006 or 2007. Whenever they came out, I just went all Vortec ever since. For lighting, I've been using the Sky for the last few years, and I love them. Those lights are 10 to 12 inches off the water, so they're not adding heat to the water, which is great. They are helping the tank stay nice and stable. The Trident, which measures my water regularly and keeps me in touch with what's going on with the water parameters on a frequent basis, has been great. I have not had issues of losing corals left and right like I used to before I had one. I mean, when you're testing water weekly, or if you're waiting even longer between testing, a lot can go wrong with SPS corals and they can die really quickly. It can be heartbreaking. You've spent 9 months, 12 months, 18 months growing this beautiful reef, and then in one day, it all just goes. It just RTNs away, rapid tissue necrosis takes over, and it's like a fire that just goes across everything, and you end up losing everything. And there have been so many times where people shared pictures of all the SPS corals going down their sidewalk. They're all dead. They're just skeletons, and it's super disappointing. But if you are maintaining everything with high quality gear, and you have good automation installed, and you're staying on top of it to make sure everything's working correctly, and you're double checking that everything's operating like it should, SPS coral keeping is not hard to do. The less automation you have, the more hands-on you're going to have to be. And if there was a crisis and you have to keep the tank going, battery backups is one method for minimal, just provide some flow, or it provides an air stone for oxygenation of the water. That's it. But if you can get your hands on a generator and you can run one where you live, that would be perfect, because then what you can do is you can plug in the chiller to keep the tank temperature the right temperature, and you can plug in the return pump to keep all the water moving through the system. With the return pump and the chiller, that's all you need for a short duration. Let's say 5 to 12 hours, maybe as much as 24 hours. But if you're going to be days on generator power, you're going to need to run the lights on the tank. You're going to make sure that the heaters are plugged into the generator. You may need to dose some additives. When your tank's in crisis mode, you only need to run the absolute essential. Lights are not essential. There's times where there's storms and the sun is blocked from the reef for a couple of days, right? That's nature. So if your tank doesn't have lights for 2 days, that's okay. If it's going to be 3, 4, 5 days, yeah, you should run some lights each day. And if you're worried about, well, I only have so much generator power because my wife wants to use the microwave or whatever, you could just say, well, I need 3 hours of light for sure. So during these 3 hours, we're not going to plug in the microwave into the generator, if that's a problem. That way you can kind of schedule when things are happening. But during the night while you're sleeping, you want to make sure that the heaters are coming on to keep the tank from getting too cold. But if your house is hot, you don't want the heaters coming on at all. So you got to figure out what time of year are we dealing with. I have been through the worst summer with no air conditioning whatsoever and no power. And I've also been, the snowpocalypse that we had a few years ago, where it was 0 degrees outside, which is crazy for Texas. I think they said this hadn't happened in like 100 or 200 years. And it was frozen outside for days. And my house was ice cold. And I was running 5 heaters in my sump, running a total of 1,500 watts of heat. My generator had no problem keeping up with that. I had it going, my TV going. I was able to keep the refrigerator plugged in so the food didn't spoil. And I kept my reef alive through the whole thing. It was a miracle that my reef did not die. And so many aquariums were lost during that event because it was bad. And the power was out for like 5-6 days. my street was out of power for, I think, a day and a half. So I got lucky. But my house was so cold. At one point, my house was 57 degrees. And Jack and I were really cold. We put a propane bottle in the middle of the room with a heater element on it, and I would use it for 1 hour and then turn it off because I was afraid of, carbon monoxide or something coming off of that thing. I just didn't want to take chances. So I just used it, just take a little bit of the edge off the room, and then like after 2 or 3 hours, I'd run it for 1 hour, and then, 4 hours no heater, and then on for an hour. And then finally, the power came on. I was lucky. I was able to turn on my central system, which has heat. And I was able to get the temperature up in the house for both of us. And, of course, the reef tank. But just keep that in mind, that having a generator, there's a lot of reasons. But the number one reason is to maintain that stability in your tank so that the SPS corals don't die. As long as nothing is dying in your tank, your water parameters will stay solid no matter what's happening with the power grid. All right, that's the end of my topic. Now let's go jump into any questions you may have, because I've been talking for an hour and a half straight. I hope that you guys found this to be helpful. Let me move this guy over just a little bit here. Dark Lad says, what do you think of SPS that come from Indonesia? I believe they culture them in the sea. There are some corals that are being aquacultured in the ocean, which is fantastic. For a while there, back in the day, we were able to get corals like that in Fiji. And then that stopped for a long time, and that recently reopened, which is exciting to me because it's another source. I've heard that some corals in Indonesia are no longer going to be exported to the US anymore. I don't know which ones. And I have to wonder about these businesses that are doing aquaculture. Is it really fair to them that these laws are being put into place when they are being grown in a way that is sustainable and that supports the aquarium hobby without affecting the ocean? And that's one of those conversations that, I'm not a great person to talk about that specifically. I just feel like there's smarter people out there than I am that can really delve into this. Maybe that would be a good conversation to have with Chris Meckley on this channel at some point. But anything that is being cultured in the ocean, that's great. And you may get some of the nice diversity that comes with the coral, and you may get tunicates, worms, microbrittle stars, bivalves. There's so many cool things that can come in. Also, SPS corals, like acropora colonies specifically, tend to have these little commensal crabs in them called bandit crabs. And they have a little mask across their eyes, so they're called a bandit. And they're super cute. And if you are getting corals, if you're lucky enough to get a coral with one of those and you need to dip the coral, you need to carefully remove that bandit crab from the coral colony with a toothpick or a dental tool. Just kind of get them to hop out into a bowl of water. Dip the coral, rinse it off, do all the whole thing. And then when you're ready to put it in the tank, put the bandit back in the colony and then put the coral inside your tank. And that little bandit crab will live in there, and it'll defend the colony, and it'll also keep it clean. It walks around in there, and it's picking at stuff, and it's eating stuff, and it's making sure that the coral stays nice and healthy. Don't dip and kill the nice crabs. KCM Aquatics says, I hope you're still here. You wrote this a long time ago. What's the easiest way for someone to start a saltwater fish only with live rock tank? We have some smaller tanks looking to start a saltwater, but can't afford all the equipment like skimmers, etc. It's really not a hard thing to set up. I mean, the name itself, the acronym, fish only with live rock. So you need an aquarium, you need some sand. I would say you got to have some sand, and you need some live rock. And you can order the live rock from a few different companies. Marco Rocks is selling live rock now. Gulf Live Rock has been selling live rock for a while. Tampa Bay Saltwater has been selling live rock forever. These are all different sources of live rock. And then you just put it in the tank, you let it cycle for a few weeks, and then you start introducing fish. It doesn't need a lot of equipment. Your one thing that you'll need to stay on top of is going to be water changes because it's a fish system. And with fish and feedings, the water parameters are going to get out of whack. but it's not nearly as demanding as this topic we just had about SPS corals and other corals, because you're not trying to keep other things alive. You're only trying to keep the water good for the fish. A protein skimmer would be great. If you could do a sump with a protein skimmer and a return pump, I would definitely incorporate that, but you don't need it initially. And when you're setting up the tank and you've got a 3-week cycle anyway, you can actually take the time. You can buy the tank, you can buy the sand, and you can buy the live rock, and you can fill the tank 3/4 of the way up, and you can just start it. Put a power head at each end and just let it do its thing. No lights, no sump, no nothing. Just let it cycle. And then after a while, you might say, okay, now I can afford the sump and the return pump. And at that point, you would then add more water to the tank to the point where water could drain down, and you fill the sump with water, you fill the tank with enough, and you get that going. And then, another month later, you buy a protein skimmer. There's companies out there, including my own, that sell things with a firm where you have monthly payments, and you could get a nice protein skimmer for your aquarium and make small payments for 4 months or 6 months and not feel the dread of having to spend a lot of money up front. But a fish only with live rock is not an expensive tank anyway. And the light won't have to be super expensive either, because we're only trying to light the tank enough to look at the fish. It's not like the type of lights we need for keeping corals. Jason commented on my stick of a Montipora. Such a tiny Monty. Jason's tank was featured in Coral Magazine 2 issues ago, and he has a digitata garden. It's just beautiful. And it grows so fast, he has to go in there and cut out huge sections. And I'm always so sad, but he has to. It has grown to the surface. It grows algae at the surface because it's broken the surface of the water, and it becomes obstruction, and flow doesn't work through the tank. So he has to go in there and trim it. Michael says, is a green slimer a good SPS for a person new to SPS? Yes. Green slimer is one of the ones that people were buying back in the day. It was very hardy. It's a little hard to glue in place because it slimes so hard. But once you get it affixed into your rock work, it grows really, really well. And green slimer is a really pretty coral. I've got some of that in my tank now. Alex says, do SPS do better in old established tanks compared to new tanks? Surprisingly, they just seem to do well in any tank that's stable. I've seen small tanks set up and large tanks set up, new tanks set up, old tanks set up. Just as long as the water quality is there, they tend to do well. It just comes down to, is there adequate flow, chaotic flow? Is there strong lighting for at least a high noon each day? And is there some kind of food source, like I said, having fish in the tank? If you get those in there, the tank could be a couple of months old. It could be, think about it. When I got my 400 gallon, I moved all my livestock out of a 280 into the 400. But then the 400 leaked, and I had to move all that livestock into a 210. And then I had to wait for my tank to be replaced. And then I set up my 400, when it finally arrived, I set it up. I got all the water circulating, so all the aquariums were one body of water, so I didn't have to worry about acclimation. And I could just move things right over. So it was a tank transfer, really. But when Dwayne and I did the reset a few years ago, we trimmed out a whole bunch, we planted corals, and they just grew like crazy. I don't know that the age of the tank is that important as much as the stability of the tank. I just think you can do it. You could have a younger tank that is 3-4 months old, and you start putting corals in there, and you see how they do. And if they do well, you get a few more and a few more, and then you kind of go crazy and you buy a bunch. But try to leave enough space between the corals to anticipate their coral growth. Because if you put a whole bunch of things near each other because it just looks so empty, because I get it. You look at all this rockscape and you have all these little 1-inch sticks sticking out. It looks really weird. But all of those are going to turn into 2-inch, 3-inch, 5-inch colonies, and they're going to be hitting each other, and they're going to start stinging each other. So we want to make sure there's enough adequate space between them to where the corals can grow and do quite well. And then at one point, your corals are going to grow so well that you're going to have to thin them out to allow flow to continue in the tank. And that was one of the things I had to do with my Shadowcaster Acropora. It was just this monster colony. When Dwayne reached in the tank to cut it, the whole thing just moved forward. It was crazy. And his mouth just dropped open. It's like, wow. And that was getting rid of it, let so much light shine into the tank and let so much flow move through the tank. It was remarkable. Oh, Waterlog says she has one of the little frag racks. The skull one? Could it be this one? So this came with a magnet that fits on the glass. And then I've got room for 2 frags on this one. Yeah, this was my other gift. So I got the pumpkin and I got the skull. Let's see. Passillipora is another really good coral to start with if you want to try SPS. So if you are wanting to delve into this side of the hobby, Passillipora, that's spelled wrong just so you know, it's Poccillopora, Passillipora. And it comes in a couple different colors. I've found one that I really like that's metallic green, but there's a hot pink one too. And what's funny is that there's tons of that around the Hawaiian Islands. And when I was snorkeling and diving, I was like, what is that coral? And they're like, that's Passillipora. I'm like, no, it's not. Like, it absolutely is, Mark. I'm like, that doesn't look anything like what's in my tank or other tanks. So it is funny how when things become large in the ocean, they may not be as recognizable as you might assume. Also, Passillipora does have the ability to broadcast itself, and you may suddenly have buds just showing up on the glass or on plumbing parts. That's never happened to me, not once. Every time I've had any of my tank people always warn me, oh, that could really spread me a problem. Not been a problem for me, but just so you know, there's a chance. Mr. Reefbuster says, I'm looking at moving up to a 125-gallon tank with a pretty heavy fish load. I'm terrible with maintenance. Would a roller mat be a better option instead of filter socks? And how many fish max? Well, first of all, the filter socks need to be changed every 3 days. And if you're terrible at it, yeah, then a roller mat would be the better choice, because the roller mat tends to last about 2 months between changes. So that'd be nice to capture some of the particulates, some of the waste, and get it out of the system. Having a big protein skimmer right after it would be also the next stage I would recommend. I just think a tank needs to have a protein skimmer at all times. And how many fish? When I was a kid, I was told you're allowed to have 1 inch of fish per gallon, and I always thought that was a terrible rule. I hated it. I would not want to overload the tank. This is not a freshwater system, it's a saltwater system. We tend to be more judicious with how many fish we get, what type of fish. If you're doing a lot of little fish, you can get a whole bunch. But if you're getting a few whales, you can only get a couple. It comes down to the species of fish, the fishes you have in mind. And we want to make sure that we have a balanced amount without conflict in the tank. Like, for example, if you're getting clownfish. If you're getting clownfish that are in pairs, you only get 2. If you're looking at a harem-type clownfish like my skunk clownfish, you need to get an odd number and a large number. That's why I have 11. If you are getting tangs, in a 125-gallon tank, you might have 1 or 2 tangs. And if you get smaller ones, you can enjoy them, but they will grow larger. And tangs can get big. The sailfin tang can pretty much become the size of a lid of a salt bucket. I mean, that's crazy. That's big. And in a 125-gallon, a sailfin tang that size would be unhappy. So can you get little fish? Like if you're getting yellow tangs from biota, they're very small. But in 5 years, they'll be mature size, and they'll be needing a larger tank. How many small biotas could you get? It all comes down to your checkbook. But seeing, 6 or 8 little tiny yellow tangs swimming around in a group is beautiful and would look great in a 125-gallon tank. If you want to get a few royal grammas, you could. If you wanted to get some anthias, you want to get a group of them. An odd number of anthias looks great in a tank too, and 125-gallon would work. But it all comes down to the livestock. It's really hard to answer, how much you can put in there. But we want to put in the right amount that the filtration can support properly. And I would say that you should order this magazine from my website. This is the Filtration for Success issue, and it talks about the bioload versus the filtration and the types of gear you could use to maintain it, and it's on Miller's Reef. Shop.millersreef.com, go to the brands section, go to corals, and you'll find that issue right there. That magazine is $10, and shipping is $6, so for $16 you get all that knowledge in one issue. Rick G says, who made your tank? I'm looking at getting a custom tank around 900 gallons. Wow! What tank manufacturer would you use? Any with a lifetime warranty. Well, my tank was made by Marineland, and mine was the last custom tank they'll ever build. That's what they told me, and I'm sure that's true. I would say at this point for your 900 gallon, you've got 3 choices that come to mind. I don't know that any of them offer a lifetime warranty. Planet Aquariums makes a great tank. Glass Cages seems to be making huge tanks. I don't know if they'll make 900 or not. And then Reef Savvy makes big tanks, but there's a super long wait, a minimum of 9 months. So those are just 3 names that come to mind. And there's other brands on the market. Or you may want to go acrylic. And if you go acrylic, the benefit of that is that that tank won't be as heavy when it's time to haul it into your home. And there are other companies that can make that. But 900 gallons, that's a lot. I mean, mine's 400 and it keeps me busy. And you're more than double. Wow. Big, big, big. What are you putting in that tank? What's your plan? That is going to be so big. Mr. Reef Buster says, would 2 AI Hydra 32 LEDs be sufficient for mixed reef? My 125 gallon is 4x2x2. I feel like the Hydra 64 would be better than the 32. I think you might need 3 for your 4-foot tank. It's just a feeling. I could be wrong. I've not run the AI Hydras, and I remember, when they came out, it just seems like I saw more of them on a tank than 2, than 1 per 2 square feet. So you might, you could start with that and see how it goes. And if you're not happy, you can add another one. I think the 64 is has a stronger intensity, has more par, and might be more beneficial for a mixed reef. Troy says that dosing will raise salinity. Well, I haven't noticed much of that in my tanks, but you're right. There definitely is that. That's why we test weekly to see where we're at. If the salinity gets a little too high, you can just remove some salt water and put in some fresh water to get it back where it needs to be. It all comes down to how much you need to dose. And if you're dosing, a small amount, it won't have much impact at all. But if you're putting in, 200 milliliters a day of calcium chloride, and you're putting in 300 milliliters a day of alkalinity, yeah, you could start to see some changes in your salinity. Sandy says, somehow I can grow SPS with using a stock 13.5 light, but my torches refuse to live for me. Torches like less flow than SPS corals. They like more flow. And there are some problems with torch corals just with the brown jelly disease situation. That seems to be pretty prevalent. That's why you see people dipping them and inspecting them for pests and ripping up barnacles and doing all these things because they're trying to make it all work. And a mixed reef is actually a challenging task. I run a mixed reef. I have SPS, I have LPS, and I have stuff in between. And I have fish too. And having that combination in the same tank can be tricky. Guys that are SPS only or people that are LPS only, they have completely different flow dynamics in the tank because they are making the amount of flow that matches the the species of coral they're trying to keep. And if you're doing an SPS dominated tank, you're going to have a lot of flow. If you're doing an LPS dominated tank, you're going to have less flow, because the increased flow would just tear up the polyps on the euphyllias and the frimphillias and the torch corals that you were talking about. Mike says, when are you going to the kalkwasser method? Probably never. I only used it once in my life, and you saw my tank, it's full. What if I use kalkwasser? Would it be fuller? I mean, I have to also, whenever I'm making a decision like that, do I want to try something? Well, how's my tank doing? Is there a reason to make that change? And I just haven't really thought of a reason other than get the nitrates under control. Thomas says, I was going to do my monthly water change next month. I have to go in Tuesday morning for shoulder surgery. Will my tank be okay until I can do a water change again? Well, you could do one this weekend and then, not do it for another 4 weeks and let your shoulder heal. Might as well work it while your shoulder's still working before it's all wrapped up. Kevin says, I just installed a hybrid light underneath the canopy that is mounted to a unistrut. I'm concerned about the strut rusting and leaching in the tank. And says, if I coat it, there will be areas of rust still forming in the corners. Should I look at some kind of plastic planter trays or acrylic soffit trays to deflect? I think you should just watch and see what happens, because the strut itself, is it aluminum or is it steel? Or is it titanium? Because certain metals, are going to be affected at certain rates. And you might find that you could coat it with something to protect it. It's just, I would do observation. I can't even say the word. I would just observe it. I was thinking in my brain, if I had some kind of exposed metal over my tank, could I apply like Vaseline to it to create like a membrane barrier to keep the salt off of it, and then just apply that from time to time. Some kind of a silicone spray that you spray onto a towel and then you wipe down the metal so that it kind of protects it from getting any kind of saltwater creep damage. That's kind of where my brain is on that. It really comes down to how close that strut is to the top of the tank, to how much likelihood of it getting hit with saltwater that could cause direct rust. But it's a good question. It's something you need to observe. You have to watch and see what it does. And then you can decide if you need to wrap it with anything to prevent it from doing anything. If the strut is completely removable, you might be able to cover it in some kind of plasti dip, like you see in the commercials where you dip the hammer handle and you have a brand new rubbery handle. Maybe you could just plasti dip the whole thing, and then it's cocooned with plastic, but it could still be rusting inside of that plastic, which does happen. As long as it doesn't leach out and drip into the tank, it doesn't matter. Waterlogged says, what is your favorite reliable heater? I always liked the Eheim Jaegers, or I'm sorry, they were called Ebo Jaegers. Now they're Eheim Jaegers, and that's what I use to this day. So I'm using glass ones. There are different ones on the market. They came out with some new ones from Sicce that were interesting. I always liked those types of heaters. Like, I think Cobalt did it for a while, where they said you can't break them, and they'd keep hitting them on the table and they wouldn't shatter. And I thought it was kind of neat. But ultimately, I just want something that's reliable and that lasts a long time. Andrea says, I can't even imagine what my electric bill would be if my house was 72. Keep in mind, I insulate the crap out of this house. I have spent many years in this home. I've been in here 25 years, and I have insulated my attic like crazy. I have put insulation in walls where I could. I've closed up holes everywhere I could, that have to do with electricity, anything I can. And I've replaced all my windows and doors. So I've got this buttoned up pretty good. And my energy consumption just depends on what's happening in Texas. My lowest energy consumption is about 1,300 kilowatts per month. That's very rare. And then my absolute worst offender, my personal best for last year, was 3,700 kilowatt hours. This year, I don't think I broke 3,000, even with our summer, because now I'm using the new split units in my studio as well as the garage. And those things are so energy efficient that I'm saving money on energy consumption. And so I've been getting, my regular, whatever the bill is, it is. I'm in an all electric home. I will never not have an electric bill, so I just got to pay it. And I'm content. I get to be comfortable. And, and yeah, I get it. Different parts of the nation, electricity costs so much, you can't do anything. I mean, I remember years ago when California reefers were talking about how they were running their lights after 6 p.m. until about 1 in the morning, so about 7 hours a day, because the electricity rate dropped at 6:01, and they could get cheaper electricity in the evening. So, we do the best we can with what we can. Jason says, I want to remind you to harvest your algae. Oh, yeah, it's beyond due. Why do you think my nitrates are up? It's because I haven't been able to get to it. I actually am doing that today, but thanks for the reminder anyway. Chad says, so I have the Sky LED lights getting ready to set up a new tank with them. Any recommendations? Well, I've been using them for 3.5 years. They're fantastic. You can actually download my schedule if you go into Sky when it's hooked up to your Fusion account, and then you can go to Schemes, and then you can find the Milev 400 gallon, and you can click that, and you can try that out on your tank and just adjust the hours, the times to match whatever schedule you like, but use the actual percentages I've got set up and see how that looks on your tank, see if you like it. It's really easy to program. I've got a bunch of, they're called, what are they called? Profiles. So this is my Sky profile list. And right here, you can see the top switch is the Sky, and right now it's at 80% because it's 4:11 p.m. in Central Standard Time. And then I've got these switches underneath these profiles. So I've got photos time, and if I switch it on, it would change the lighting of the tank for taking pictures. If I want the tank to glow crazy blue, I just do make it glow. If I want to run all the lights at 100%, I would just go to that one and turn it on, and then it just kind of looks like a day on the beach. And then back in the day when I was streaming in front of my reef tank, I had the streaming profile, which made the tank look yellow to the eye, but looked perfect for the camera. And then evening mode is one I grabbed from Dwayne's lights, and it's kind of a calm blue, relaxing look at the tank while you're watching TV in the same room. And it's really easy to install these schemes I was talking about. You would just go to, let's see, right there. I'm grabbing a screenshot. You would go into the Sky itself, and then right there, there's the thing with an arrow going to the right, and then there's one with a download arrow. That's what you do, download the scheme. And when you hit download scheme, you will then see, I'm grabbing all these things for you. There's the Milev Sky settings, and you just install that. So you see, it says it here under My Schemes, but it'll probably be on, because it is mine. You would see it on the Discover tab, and it would be mine right there, and you would just install that one and try it out. And then once you try it out, you can say, I love it, or you can say, I hate it, or you can adjust it, you can change it. So you have lots of choices. But it's super easy to use. It's set it and forget it, basically. I don't tinker with it. I don't mess with it. I basically set up my schedule years ago. The only difference is that, and I showed this earlier, and I'll put it on the screen again. When you look at this schedule right now, you'll see there's a bunch of 80/80s right there in the center. And that is what mine are and have been for years. But originally, the schedule that's in that download scheme thing, I think is maxed at 60% because it was when I first set it up. And it's funny because you would think that the profile that I created for my lighting, if I change it, you'd think you'd be getting that, but you're getting the original one I made, and there's no way to edit the original one. And the only way to get you the kind I'm using now would be to delete mine, and I don't want to lose the ratings. You know, it's been rated as a good choice of a lighting spectrum. And so I just tell people, try it out. It's perfect for trying out. And then over a period of weeks or a month or two later, then at that point you could increase the intensities to stronger, to what works best for your reef aquarium. HB Photography says, does more lighting translate into more growth, even on small aquariums? Yes, the light intensity is what turns into growth, but having it for 12 hours or 15 hours or 20 hours would not give you a tank full of corals. That doesn't happen. So we want to just have the right amount at the right intensity for the right duration each day. And we don't want to overtax the corals, but we do want to have the right amount to get growth. If the light fixture like came with your aquarium and was kind of weak, and yeah, it's great to look at fish swim in a circle, but it doesn't grow anything, besides maybe nuisance algae, that would be no good. But you get a reef light, and there's lots of lights advertised made for reefing, so you can just pretty much pick and choose and look at the reviews, and ideally you want to find people with that light on their aquarium to look at their tank and say, I really like what you've done with your tank. I want my tank to look like that. Let me find you another video. I'm pretty sure I have another one down here somewhere. This one here was from a year ago. And my lighting is the same lighting. Wow, I cannot believe my tank looked like that a year ago. That's probably not true. That's just what this tab is called. It's called a year ago. It's probably longer. But that right there was where my tank was, and now my tank is absolutely densely packed, and some of the corals have died off over the last year or so because of some issues, and I had some bad magnets in my skimmer. But having the right intensity will get you nice, good, phenomenal growth. And actually, when I reset my tank, it's going to look like this again. But for now, the tank unfortunately looks like this. Which, it's okay. Actually, it looks like this. Because that's where it is right now. This is last night. And I know it's kind of dark. Sorry about that. Okay. Tim says, I'm in my 5th week of cycling a new tank with dry rock and live sand. I've noticed clear snot like slime. Is this part of the cycle? My light is off. No, clear snot is not normal in a cycle. The cycle should just be a raising of ammonia, then nitrite, then nitrate. Are you dosing anything in that tank of any kind of additives whatsoever? The clear stuff could be, oh, you know what? The dry rock that you used, did you soak it in vinegar by any chance? Because the clear snot could be a type of bacterial growth that you need to siphon out of the system, or even take the rocks out one by one and rinse them off in some tank, in some used tank water, and then put them back in the tank. But that bacteria stuff should dissipate if it doesn't have anything to fuel further growth. So as long as you don't put any kind of food in the tank, you're not providing light, it should just kind of collapse upon itself and just dissipate entirely. But it may have come from vinegar in the system. Yeah, that hurt. So Aquaball said they just got home from the local fish store and got some alpha reef. I ordered some from Saltwater Aquarium, but it can't because of the hurricane. No, that hurricane was bad. It's affecting everything. So I've actually been trying to find some friends and check on them, see how they're doing. And I'm sure it affected some businesses. So, heads up, be patient when this time of year when things like Hurricane Helene happened, because that kind of stuff can affect everything, including even for trucks driving across highways that are obliterated. I was like, what's that sound? My tank is topping off. And it finished. Let's see. Mr. Reef Buster says, I'll definitely get that magazine. Can I put in 2 to 3 small tangs, 5 anthias, 2 clowns, and a wrasse? Yes, you can. That would work on a 125 gallon. And then at what interval? Well, if you're starting the tank from scratch and you have to go through the cycle, you're probably going to put in something initially. Maybe the 2 clowns would be a good start. Make sure that they're okay and make sure that they do well for a few weeks. And then after that, you could then add your wrasse, because wrasses and clowns don't have any territorial issues. And then you could add the anthias another month or 2 after that. I mean, you can do it gradually. I wouldn't put them in all at once, that's for sure. I would put them in gradually. But you can wait a few weeks between additions, and then, I'd put the tangs in last. Tangs tend to become territorial. Ed says, have you any experience with the Tunzi 6105 Eco Flow pumps? I've had the older Tunzi 6105 pumps before and haven't had the best of luck with them. Any info on the Tunzi Ecos? No, I haven't used those. I used Tunzi Turbel and then Tunzi Streams in the early 2000s, but once the Vortex came out, I jumped ship, and I've been with Vortex ever since because I love them. Anthony says he loves the Helio heaters, the best he's ever had. Mr. Reef Buster said, how much is your monthly electric bill? I'm thinking of moving from Texas from New Jersey, but hearing you speak about power outages in your area and having to invest in a generator scares me because we don't have outages here in the Northeast. Well, lucky you. It also comes down to where you live. It isn't that just power outages all the time, left and right. But when monster things happen, like the giant ice storm that knocked out power for millions of people, it happens. My neighborhood is an older neighborhood. My house is from 1970. And right across the street, those neighbors almost never lose power because right behind their home, it's business. So that business grid gets priority and gets power. So the tile store and the car wash, they all have power. And my neighbors across the street are sitting there watching TV. And I'm over here twiddling my thumbs thinking, man, it'd be nice to have electricity right now. But you ask me how much I pay for electricity. I pay nothing. It's dirt cheap because I'm locked in a commercial contract. I pay 5 cents per kilowatt hour. So my electric bill tends to be between 200 and as bad as 400. And that's worst case scenario when I'm absolutely using all the power I can possibly get my hands on. But like I was talking about earlier, I was mentioning how many kilowatt hours. That's a lot more accurate. I just got my bill here a few days ago. I'm not sure where it is. Oh, here it is. So my last bill I got said I used 2,658 kilowatt hours. And that's really what matters. How much power are you using? And then what are you using it for? Mine is mostly the air conditioner. I mean, that's the reality. It's me and a dog and then aquariums. And of course, I'm running a business where I'm cutting acrylic and stuff. But this bill this month was $305. And this is for a 4-bedroom, 2-bath house with a 400-gallon reef tank and other things too. So, whenever people talk about their bill, I always say, how many kilowatt hours did you use? Because that's all that matters. Because if you're paying 17 cents per kilowatt hour and I'm paying 5 cents per kilowatt hour, my bill will always sound cheaper than yours because I'm paying a lesser amount. I locked into that rate for a 5-year plan. My contract is through June of next year. So next year, my rate's going to go up, and I'm nervous. I happen to look what the rates were right now. We have a thing here called Power to Choose, and it lets you pick your energy providers. And it looks a lot different. They've updated the website, or they've made it more simple because, I don't know, they just changed it. It was way better before. I liked it because you could really go through and learn about each company and what they're charging and the fine print. And now it was like this super simple dummy list, and you just look at all the numbers like, okay. And it seems like all the numbers were around 12 cents per kilowatt hour, which is more than double what I'm paying now. But I am paying for commercial rates and not for residential rates. But also, this is the worst time of year to shop for electricity. You want to find it in, like, you want to shop for electricity in March when you're in Texas, because that's when the rates are lower because the weather's cooler and the rates are lower. They go up as the summer gets hotter, and so the rates will be nice and high. It's sort of like how the price of gasoline goes up and down. Same thing with electricity. It's kind of weird. And it looks like that's it. We don't have any more questions. The reason I don't do solar here is because I can't get 2,658 kilowatt hours. I mean, let's just take that number right there. 2,658 divided by 30 days. So I'm averaging about 89 kilowatt hours per day. And I think at best, with full sunlight, no trees, no shade, which is insane. I will never cut down my trees. I might be able to get 65 kilowatt hours from a solar panel array. And possibly less. And then if I wanted to keep the power, I got to buy a battery array to capture it all, so I have the batteries to rely on when the sun's not out, like during the night. So solar's, when you think about solar power, I've done quite a bit of homework on it, and I'm just like, it's not for me. If it could keep up with my demand, that'd be one thing. But if I'm going to have to pay for solar panels for like 30 years, which I'm not doing, by the way, and I'm paying the electric company also, I'm not winning. You know who's winning? The people making the panels, or the guy talking me in the sale, and then the finance company that's financing this money. Mathematically, it doesn't work for me. And I'm absolutely not getting rid of my trees. I've actually had the solar companies, I said, come on out. Let's hear your sales pitch. And they're just like, we looked up your address. You have these really large trees. Are you willing to cut those? Like, absolutely not. And they stopped calling me. I was like, perfect. No, solar is probably good for specific people. I have quite a few neighbors that have solar panels. I actually would love to have a few conversations with those people and say, all right, so what are you paying? And, what are you not paying? And how does it work? And what do you do? My friend in Hawaii who lives in Lahaina, when that big fire happened a year ago, her house is all solar, and she has the power wall inside her garage. And so her house actually had power when the whole grid collapsed. And she had that, but she had no water, and something else she didn't have internet, she didn't have power. She happened to have one of those Tesla satellite systems to set up some internet, so that gave her that. But the water was toxic and the air was toxic, and they warned you couldn't even be in your home because the wind blowing across all the stuff that had burned to the ground was toxic, and it would put stuff in your lungs. So she lived in a hotel, like, I don't know, 20 minutes away from her home, or 30 minutes away from her home, or an hour, for months, waiting until they gave the all clear to come back to her home, which had solar power. So she had that benefit of having free electricity, so to speak, when there was no power grid to even turn to. But then the water was considered poisonous. That was their words. And you couldn't drink it or anything. You had to go somewhere with jugs to get water to bring it back to your house. So no matter where you live, something can go wrong, and your life can be really difficult. But in the end, it comes down to what is best for you. And for me, I'm fine with paying the power bill. It is what it is. I just use it. I mean, I'm not scared of paying the electricity bill. The lower the rate, the better. That's all I got to say. HB Photography says, let's perfect lead into our ending here. So he said, what would you consider an essential weekly test? What do you test weekly? I test alkalinity, calcium, magnesium, phosphate, nitrate. I look at my tank temperature. I look at pH, just because those are they're recorded by the different apps I use for the Hydros and the Apex. And that's it. You just test those in all your tanks. And if you check all of those, you can then see if you need to supplement anything or if you have to make any changes. When it comes to phosphate, if my tank gets too high, I just use Phosphate RX to bring it down. Nitrates get too high, I do ginormous water changes. But now, hopefully, when I get that new reactor I mentioned set up, it can start removing it from the system. And that would be really nice, because that really has been my Achilles heel, was nitrate. I've been talking about it on and off for years, and I did get it to come down quite a bit, but then when I neglect my algae turf scrubber, it causes nitrates to rise, and it just keeps feeding them because I am not dealing with it, because I can't get to it, because it's impossible to get to. So I always have something to work on here. That's how it always is. And but testing these parameters, and of course check your salinity. I don't think I said that. If you're making sure all these things are in check, it will definitely protect the livestock that you have in your aquarium, and help your animals not just live, but thrive. Guys, I hope you had a good time today with the stream, and I will see you again next weekend. Bye.